Yassas. Welcome to Greek Like Me, the podcast about all things Greek, for Greeks, Hellenophiles, and anyone interested in learning about other cultures. I'm your host, Pamela Diodes Wood. Email us at stealthgreek@gmail.com to share comments, questions, and stories about Greeks, Greekness, or your own ethnic background. We're back with an episode we'd planned to drop during Black History Month, even though the Civil Rights Movement is not just Black history, it's American history. But I was still digging into the facts regarding Greek America and Black America and the Civil Rights Movement past our deadline, and I'm still digging. There's a huge amount of information, and thankfully, some truly awesome Greek American scholars who write about it. We can never tell the entire story with any of our topics, but the level of research I want to do for every episode can't be done week to week. A friend recently suggested I was doing research on the level of her grad students who turned in 3 papers a term while we're trying to put out episodes weekly, and lately not succeeding. I'm getting too old for all-nighters. Hence, we are announcing, just past our 1-year anniversary, Greek Like Me is officially switching from weekly updates to semi-weekly episodes. We'll be offering well-researched topics without aggravating my loved ones or having a 2-day crash after an episode drops. Greek Americans and the Civil Rights Movement wound up being a 2-part episode. This episode, episode 1, has dropped in the pre-Lenten period for Orthodox Christianity. Episode 2 will drop during Lent, which, as Eduardo pointed out, is totally appropriate for a podcast about Greeks. Because as Orthodox Christians, we're supposed to be reacquainting ourselves with our faith right now, which recognizes no racial or ethnic boundaries or differences. And we are bound at this time to rededicate ourselves to the practice of that faith, which emphasizes first and foremost, we treat others as we wish to be treated. If I want to enjoy civil rights, I am obligated by my religion to demand the same rights for everyone else. Parts 1 and 2 of this episode are likely to be separated by more than 2 weeks, as we're now on a semi-weekly schedule, and March 21st is reserved for the celebration of Greek Independence Day later that week. We have a trigger warning. This episode contains violence, including brutal attacks on unarmed civilians and the death of children. It also contains a lot of Christian references because both the Black Civil Rights Movement and the Greek community of the 1950s and 60s were very church and Christ-oriented. They used their faith and belief systems to guide their people and chart their paths through an often treacherous landscape of racism, anti-immigrant fervor, and an obstinate denial of civil rights to non-citizens. The Civil Rights Movement was a grassroots, largely church-driven series of protests and demands for equality for a group of Americans systematically denied the right to vote, to use public amenities, like using a public bathroom or a water fountain, denied their rights to sit in a movie theater, eat in a restaurant, stay in a hotel, pursue a career and education solely based on the color of their skin. Black Americans often couldn't walk down the street in white neighborhoods, couldn't be seen after sunset in some white towns, the meaning of sundown towns, which still exist in parts of America. It means no blacks allowed there after sundown. Civil rights was also about protecting Black men, women, and children from unwarranted harassment and to give them equal protection under the law. People were still robbed, beaten, raped, murdered, lynched, without any recourse, any justice. White perpetrators just walked away. White police had total immunity. We haven't seen the end of this behavior, unfortunately. But by the 1950s and 60s, it was still incredibly common, particularly in the South. Nationwide, Black men and women were still denied entry into most colleges, and therefore most professions. Their children were crowded into inferior schools with outdated books. When protesting this unfair treatment through peaceful demonstrations, Black Americans were viciously and violently attacked, again without legal recourse. Every year on Martin Luther King Day and during Black History Month, Greek American newspapers, websites, and the Greek Orthodox Archdiocese of America display the famous Life magazine cover from March 26, 1965. Archbishop Yakovos stands on the steps of the Dallas County Courthouse in Selma, Alabama, next to the Reverend Martin Luther King at the culmination of a march for civil rights in the memory of a murdered ally. It was and is a proud moment for Greek Americans. But there's much more to the story of Greek America and the civil rights movement, some of it uplifting and wonderful, and some not so much. I didn't plan for Archbishop Yakovos to dominate the topic, especially in episode 2. I wanted to share stories of Greek allies from all over the country. Alex Goulas of Birmingham, Alabama, who played a part in integrating the jazz scene in that state. Tony Constant of Baltimore, who chaired a committee of Greek restaurant owners that convinced half of the restaurants in the state to desegregate. Chris's Hot Dogs in Montgomery, Alabama. I think they're still there. They welcomed black regulars, including Mrs. Rosa Parks and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., in spite of KKK threats to burn the place down. Johnny Otis ran away from California's segregation laws so he could marry his high school sweetheart, a black woman. He became a well-known rock and roll singer and civil rights activist who deserves his own podcast. And there was Father Sam Juvelis, who spoke up for equal rights in his parish in Birmingham, Alabama. We'll be talking more about Father Juvelis and his experiences later in this episode. While researching, I found Yakovos did dominate and often drive Greek participation in the civil rights movement. So he really is the place to open this discussion on Greek like me. The Archbishop was the voice of the Greek community for 37 years. Yakovos bolstered and encouraged Greeks who were already allies, galvanized those maintaining a Greek-centric attitude into joining the national discourse, and shamed those who picked the wrong side, the don't rock the boat side, that feared doing more than turning a blind eye as people continued to suffer degrading oppression. The dilemma U.S. immigrants faced trying to straddle the line of doing what was right and protecting their own, of acknowledging their differences but trying to assimilate enough to be allowed to succeed, put Greeks on both sides of the civil rights movement, then and now. And in a country where proving your Americanness frequently meant immigrants proving their whiteness, we've sometimes betrayed our Greekness, which at its very core demands equality for all. For our listeners outside of the United States, non-Americans have often expressed sincere puzzlement about our references to whiteness in America. Whiteness here does not mean pale skin, not entirely. The system set in place when the enslavement of black people became a driving economic force in America was established to separate the ruling Anglos from everyone else. Its purpose was to sway poor and indentured Anglos into siding with their often abusive and greedy betters, so they wouldn't continue to side with black and native slaves and servants in protesting injustice and poor treatment. There were several early uprisings of poor folks of all colors against the rich landholders, who honestly didn't consider poor whites to be human either, but they were outnumbered. So give the poor white a reason to feel superior to someone else and feel loyalty toward the controlling few. Unfortunately, it's still a thing, which explains our healthcare system. It's that old American adage, I'd rather pay a dime than let a black man have a nickel, which is so ingrained in our culture since the 17th century. Therefore, Irish were originally considered less than Brits. Southern and Eastern Europeans, and for a time even Scandinavians, were considered inferior because they had strange non-Anglo ways and were competition for jobs in the money pot. Though my Swedish grandmother was considered acceptable to everyone but her in-laws in the 1920s, my Greek grandparents were certainly not. Greeks had to wiggle their way into whiteness along with Italians, Portuguese, and Spanish in order to find means to prosper. And that sometimes meant ignoring the unfair treatment of those who would never achieve whiteness because of the color of their skin. We Greeks proudly point to our ancestors in the Greek fight for independence from Ottoman oppression. We don't forget Greeks were limited or outright denied opportunities for education, freedom of movement, freedom of religion. We don't forget Greeks were targeted, harassed, sometimes beaten or killed for being Greeks in the Ottoman world that owned them. We don't forget the hundreds of thousands of Greek slaves, or those forced into harems or forcibly converted to Islam. We don't forget that the entire nation of Greece was a slave state, because anyone who denied or insulted a Turk could see their entire village burned to the ground, its inhabitants sold on slave blocks. But some of us conveniently forget that others have lived through these horrors as well, and in our lifetime, and to some extent still are. We forget that as a people, Greeks have a long history of commiseration and empathy for Black Americans. The original Greeks who fought for independence, the OGs, recognized the inhumanity and the evils of slavery that existed in the United States. At the beginning of the war against Ottoman rule, Petros Mavromichalis, a great Greek general and patriot, sent an appeal to the citizens of the United States in May 1821, requesting aid for Greece in its fight for independence. This was 40 years before the American Civil War. In the appeal, where he's asking for money, arms, official recognition, he alludes to the 1808 American Resolution that halted the transatlantic slave trade, but not the practice of slavery in the South. He wrote, "Your freedom does not rest on the slavery of other nations. You wish that all men should partake of these blessings and enjoy the rights which nature intended for all. It is you who first asserted these rights, and you who have first again recognized them in restoring to the oppressed Africans the character of men." Apparently it went over their heads. Americans who joined the fight for Greek independence out of love for classical Greece came away horrified by the cruelty of oppression and the suffering of the Greeks they saw firsthand, and most of them could no longer accept slavery in their own nation and became outspoken abolitionists. 40 Greek orphans rescued during the war and sent to be educated in America made a mark on both Greece and America. Most of those children went on to university and returned to Greece to help their people establish their country. But some stayed in the United States and distinguished themselves in politics, military service, or business. A number of them grew up to be outspoken abolitionists, committed to fighting against the oppression of Blacks, the way their martyred parents, and ironically many Americans, had fought against the oppression of Greeks. Neo published an article about two of these men. John Kalivergis Zachos and Christoforos Kastinis dedicated their lives to the cause, using their own experience to call for an end to slavery in the United States. According to sociologist and author Charles Moskos Jr., after the end of the Civil War, Zachos became an educational pioneer among Black people. Education of Black people being one of those things very much frowned upon in the former slave states. Moskos also mentions Fotis Fisk. Many of the Greek orphans were adopted by Americans, so that's where Fisk comes from. Fisk had an exemplary Navy career and left his estate to the abolitionist cause. The late 19th and early 20th centuries saw a flood of Greek immigrants entering the United States. For a long time, Greek laborers worked side by side with Black men, relegated to a manual labor considered acceptable for their respective stations in life. Like Black Americans, they were considered less than. But the Greeks had a genetic advantage, their paler skin. And in time, they began to claw their way up the food chain. There are countless examples of Southern Greek restaurant owners in the 1920s and 30s who did not comply with Jim Crow's segregation laws. And there are those who did, for fear of being targeted at a time when Greeks, according to the federal government, were not considered white. That's a true thing, and that's a whole other episode coming. Greeks back then still related to the oppression Blacks in America were experiencing. Their families were still being targeted as minorities in Asia Minor, as well as throughout the United States. But by the 1960s, many Greeks felt they were beginning to be accepted by white America, by the ones running the show and their poor white allies. Greeks were succeeding in business, often running restaurants, and were finally able to start sending their children to college. Education that had been denied their not-so-far-off ancestors in Greece, just as an equal education was still being denied black citizens in the United States. Many Greeks were becoming professionals, doctors, lawyers, businessmen, positions denied most Greeks during Ottoman oppression, positions until very recently denied most blacks in America. And for all of the American Greeks who were raised understanding those parallels and who didn't blind themselves to the suffering played out all over again in the black community of America, Archbishop Iakovos was a shining example of what Greeks and Orthodox Christians were supposed to be. When the man who would become Iakovos was first coming up through the ranks, Archbishop Michael led the Greek Orthodox faithful in the Americas from 1949 to 1958. He publicly and formally opposed segregation and racism. In 1958, under his authority, the Archdiocese Director of Public Relations responded to an American theology student's questions on race and the position of the Greek Orthodox Church. Arthur Lord responded, "The Orthodox Church has always been democratic without prejudice in reference to race or color," and explained to that student that segregation in the U.S. as Orthodox would mean separating brothers and sisters in the faith. I mean, think about it. Greeks and Russians separated from Lebanese, Copts and Syrians, from Ethiopians and Kenyans and Indians, people who all prized their cultural identities but shared orthodoxy equally. 4 years later, during the tenure of Iakovos, Lord was asked again for the church position on race, this time by a researcher from Tennessee. Lord answered for the Archdiocese, "The Orthodox Church is unequivocally against segregation of any kind." He further stated that all Americans should have equal rights and opportunities according to the principles of the faith. After the sudden death of Archbishop Michael, may his memory be eternal, Iakovos became Archbishop of the Greek Orthodox Church in North and South America, leading the church from 1959 until 1996 with civil rights as a focus. He was born Dimitrios Koukouzis in 1911 on the island of Imbros in Turkish territory. Athanasios Gramenos, a researcher and instructor specializing in the role of diasporas in religion, says Iakovos experienced the state-sponsored discrimination against the ethnic Greek inhabitants. State-sponsored. When he was ordained, he asked to come to the U.S., believing in the freedom and equality our country espoused, but didn't always practice. He rose to the ranks, representing the church at the 1957 conference of the World Council of Churches in Geneva. It was there he first met Dr. Martin Luther King, who was then president of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, a civil rights organization made up of black churches. According to Father Michael Varlamos, from 1959 to 1963, Iakovos felt strongly about supporting the civil rights movement, but was cautious in his official actions because the advancement of Greeks in America was officially his priority. So instead of taking an official public stance as Archbishop, he guided the clergy and the congregants towards the issue. He wasn't acting on his principles. He was acting on the stated and revered principles enshrined in the Greek Orthodox belief system. Varlamos says Iakovos wholeheartedly believed in the Orthodox Christian doctrine that embraced all races in a theocentric view of humanity, which compelled his advocacy and activism, that all races were equally deserving of human and civil rights. To that end, in the early 1960s, 33 Orthodox and Protestant denominations in the northern states advocated from their pulpits for legislative action to end discrimination and segregation in the South. The North wasn't all rainbows and unicorns either. Plenty of racism happening up here. But the target had to be laws on the books in the southern states making it legal to treat American citizens as second class because of their skin color, the Jim Crow laws. Greeks were able to vote, unlike most black citizens in the South. In 1960, Archbishop Iacovos appointed Father Sotirios Juvelis to the Birmingham parish of Holy Trinity Holy Cross. Juvelis was Iacovos' protege. Born in Philadelphia, he'd previously served several northern parishes. And after relocating to Alabama, he became involved in the struggle for black freedom in America. Andrew W. Manis, professor of history at Middle Georgia State University and author of several books about the Civil Rights era, describes the position of Greeks in the Deep South in the early part of the 20th century. They purposed to preserve their access to the social ladder by convincing fellow Southerners, especially the Klan, that Greek immigrants would become the right sort of American. For self-preservation, Manis refers to the writings of labor historian Dan Georgiakos, who showed how immigrants' fear of retribution by whites, rather than racism itself, opened the path of opportunity for Greek immigrants. They were in no position to challenge the color line. The result would have been empty stools and tables at least, more likely broken windows, smashed heads, and possibly worse, end quote. A lot of the Greeks in the South got along to get along. In February 1962, Iacovos directed his parishes to take specific actions that included working to bring about desegregation of schools, neighborhoods, public transportation, lunch counters, restaurants, and other public accommodations. The clergy was to encourage congregants of the Greek Orthodox Church to support legislation meant to guarantee full opportunity for all people, regardless of race, color, or nationality, and against legislation maintaining segregation and racial discrimination. Iacovos was walking that fine line, encouraging just action by his congregants without public statements that would rile up the white majority against the Greeks. Greek voters in Alabama were almost equally divided against each other, with earlier Greek immigrants believing Greeks were sacrificing their Greekness and their decency to placate the predominant white racist culture. Religious communities were divided as well, and this was the situation Father Juvelis found himself in. But soon he would redouble his efforts to push equality. He was approached during his sermon on September 15th, 1963, by a man who took him aside and informed him that the 16th Street Baptist Church, 2 miles from Holy Trinity Holy Cross, had been attacked. 16th Street Baptist was the largest black church in Birmingham, the most segregated city in the United States. The church was the anchor of the black community, and in the early 1960s acted as a command center for civil rights meetings and those planning rallies and marches. Many of the groups in Alabama met at 16th Street Baptist to begin their marches, including the Children's Crusade just 4 months earlier in May of 1963, when many of the children and adults participating were injured by police attack dogs and high-powered water hoses turned on them. September 15th was a Sunday morning. It was Youth Day at the 16th Street Baptist Church, and the children had left their classrooms in the basement to join their families upstairs for worship. The day's theme was A Love That Forgives. 5 little girls had stopped into the ladies' room downstairs to chat and adjust their dresses before going up, as 11 to 14-year-old girls will do. 4 Klansmen had planted a bomb under a stairwell on the side of the church. It exploded just as the congregation was preparing to start prayers around 11 a.m. Bombed on a Sunday morning during services, in the one place in a Christian city where people believed themselves to be safe. 22 people were injured. 4 of the little girls who'd stopped on their way to join the service died in the wreckage of the church. The 5th, the sister of one of the dead, was pulled from the rubble and survived after losing an eye. The children who died were Addie Mae Collins, Denise McNair, Carol Robertson, and Cynthia Wesley. May their memories be eternal. Sarah Collins is the survivor. And we have to wonder how many more children would have died if they hadn't left their classrooms to celebrate Youth Sunday, if they'd stayed in their classrooms that morning as they normally did. After he was told what had happened at the neighboring church, Father Juvelis returned to the pulpit to announce to his congregation, "Today, part of Christ's body suffers. Our brothers and sisters have been brutally attacked by the forces of evil. The 16th Street Baptist Church was bombed this morning." The horror of it was enough to propel more members of the church to support Father Juvelis' efforts, but not all. Archbishop Iakovos was also triggered into action by the news. It must have stirred the horror and trauma he experienced in his early years. Anyone pushing back against the Ottomans, looking for fairness or freedom or equality, was massacred along with their villages, priests, their homes and churches desecrated and destroyed. And here it was happening in America, where Iakovos believed that equality for all people was a realization of the dreams of his youth. Instead, the white nationalists in power in the South were terrorizing black people, seeking the right to vote, to educate their children or use public facilities. The heirs of these races are still at work in this country. Archbishop Iakovos, representing the Greek Orthodox Archdiocese of the Americas, finally made a public statement about race relations in America. Here's an excerpt. "The Greek Orthodox Church is against segregation and believes in the full equality of all peoples. Our church believes that all Americans, regardless of faith or color, should be granted equal opportunities for public education, employment in all fields of endeavor, should enjoy equal advantages, and be the beneficiaries of equal public accommodations and facilities. We call upon citizens of all faiths and those who cherish truth and justice to oppose every expression and demonstration of bigotry. But the Christians of America have a special mandate to work for equal rights. Christian love is not a semantic symbol. It is a commandment to which we must conform our actions as Christians and strive in every way to make a reality consistent with the will of God, which was expressed by Jesus Christ when he said, 'Love ye one another.'" Iakovos now lobbied Congress to pass the Civil Rights Act and instructed the clergy under his authority to contact their political representatives in Congress and the Senate, thus leading a majority of ethnic American Orthodox Christians into the movement to support civil rights, Varlamos tells us. There were Greek racists. Racism is a disease that invades and rots. But more often, congregants in the South feared backlash against their businesses, homes, and families. They were afraid of the folks they were trying to assimilate with. So some of the southern Greek parishes pushed back. Mail the archdiocese received in favor of the archbishop's actions were running more than 2-to-1 against those who disapproved. Most disapproving were in the southern states. Meanwhile, Father Juvelis asked his congregation to contribute to a fund for helping victims of the 16th Street Baptist Church with hospital bills, repairs to the church, and to contribute toward the little girls' funerals. Many of the congregation approved and passed the basket. Others did not. In fact, the parish council president threatened Father Juvelis, afraid of what the segregationists of the town would do to them. On October 8th, Father Juvelis met with the Ministers' Association of Greater Birmingham, which included mostly white Protestant ministers, and he made a motion to support local black leaders in advocating for the hiring of black police officers to patrol the black areas of town. The motion carried. Local newspapers printed the story of the troublemaking Greek, and Greek businesses began reporting angry customers boycotting over Juvelis' actions. A segment of his parish began to push back against the priest. As in any church, there was a powerful opponent to Father Juvelis at Holy Trinity Holy Cross. Probably one of the more successful, more moneyed, and more accepted by white Alabama society Greeks. This man spread rumors about the priest. I have no details on what these rumors were, but have witnessed similar behavior in my church in years past. It's disturbing. It's disgusting. The priest was verbally abused and threatened. Church correspondence and church records circumvented him, making it harder for him to run his parish. Archbishop Iakovos received a letter from this upstanding leader of the church, demanding Father Juvelis be removed from his position. Instead, Iakovos expressed his 100% support for this man of conscience. I try really hard to understand the behavior of these people and the fear and the desire to move up within American society. Georgios Anagnostou, a professor in the Department of Classics at Ohio State University and an expert in modern Greek culture and identity, the Greek diaspora, and American ethnic studies, writes about the Greeks who pushed back against Archbishop Iakovos and Father Jouvelis. In an article for the Papist Post, he says, groups of the Southeastern European community internalized and perpetuated American racial hierarchies, often for their own gain. That was their Faustian deal for acceptance, often out of fear, and the reason for their reticence to rock the Jim Crow boat. America has run on this kind of fear since before it was a country. And as long as we ethnics make that Faustian bargain of advancement in exchange for acceptance, America will always be much less than it was meant to be. And Archbishop Iakovos didn't buy into that. 2 weeks after those little girls were murdered in a cowardly attack by white racists, he called for American citizens to refrain from actions of bigotry because equality and justice should obey Christian principles of love and understanding. Remembering that these same racists then and now proclaim themselves Christians. He said violence is a threat to democracy, and he was right. In episode 2 of Greeks in the Civil Rights Movement, we'll discuss how Archbishop Iakovos joined Dr. Martin Luther King on the famous march in Selma that wound up on the cover of that Life magazine, and the backlash he faced. We'll see how the deaths of those little girls and others who died and suffered because of racist American policy prompted him to become an unrelenting and adamant advocate for civil rights, and how he took the entire Greek Orthodox Archdiocese of America along for the ride. Axios, he is worthy of every good thing. Thanks for listening. Greek Like Me is a Stealth Greek production. This episode was researched, written, and narrated by me, your host, Pamela Diodes Wood. Our producer, photographer, and post-production editor is Douglas John. Many thanks to Eduardo Gil for helping chase down elusive sources. Visit our website at stealthgreek.com for resources, photos, links, and more. Please rate, like, and subscribe. It helps us get noticed so we can keep making content about Greeks and Greek culture. Find Greek Like Me on Facebook and Instagram at Greek_like_me. See you next time for our Greek Independence Day episode. Yassas.